Jeff, I want to talk about authority in the church. And you can approach that question from many aspects. You can think about the magisterium, the official teaching office comprised of pope and bishops and what their role is. You can think about the role of the theologians. We even talk about a magisterium of the theologians based on their persuasive power and arguments. We can talk about the authority of the priests and pastoral ministers in parishes. But I want to talk in this program about the authority of the laity in the church. And that requires maybe some background. Part of the problem when you begin to talk that way is people say, well, what are you talking about authority of the laity? The laity don't have any authority in the church. So we had that terrible statement that the real job of the laity was to obey, pay and obey. I think it was, we comments said. They were simply seen to be passive dependent at the bottom of the pyramid. The power of authority sort of run out. It was poured out upon the pope and the bishops and the priests in diminishing fashion, and not much left for the laity. So we have a long history here when we begin to think about the role of the laity and the very negative perceptions about them having any authority.
In the 19th century, when Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman, was raising questions about talking with the laity, consulting them in matters of doctrine, one of the bishops said, well, who are the laity? And Newman responded, the church would look very foolish without them.
It's a great line.
I think there's
who
an
are the
immense power
laity?
there. That's
church looks very foolish without any lay people. Newman was great with that and had a wonderful sense of the role of the laity. And I think there was a time when, going back to Newman, where he said that at times the laity knew the truth when the bishops' hearts were hardened to it.
Historically, with the problem of Arianism in the church in the 4th century, it's very likely that most of the bishops in the church were Arians. That is to say, they did not believe in the divinity of Jesus, that Jesus was God. Jesus was the best of all creatures, but not God. And it was the lay people who led the charge, who became aware of following Athanasius, the deacon, saying that, well, if God didn't become human, then humanity is not transformed. We're not saved. We can't be saved by another creature. I mean, it was that awareness, it was that sense of the faithful that made the difference.
Newman was very taken by that one historical example. It had a major role in his own conversion process to the Roman Catholic Church from Anglicanism, and it was that kind of historical study that put him in the direction of moving towards Rome. But I mean, he actually said that the faith was kept alive then by the laity. They were the real authority in terms of teaching what was authentic in the gospel, where the bishops had lost it. It's a remarkable historical example, Arianism we're talking about, in the 4th century.
When I use the word church with the students that I have, in most of their minds, when you say church, it means hierarchy to them. It means popes and bishops. But I mean, the church is the whole people of God, and there are people within that group called to service in roles like pope and bishop and presbyter and so forth. But the great majority of the folks in the church are the lay people.
That's right. We often say, where is the church? And somebody say, well, the church is where the pope is. Irenaeus, going back to one of the early church fathers, he died around 202. His statement is, where the Spirit is, there is the church. And it's a much broader kind of statement than saying where the hierarchy is, there is the church. Where the Spirit is, there is the church, suggests the theological basis for any authority that the laity or the baptized people have. That is, it comes through their baptism, through their confirmation, in which they are made full members of the church, are made co-responsible for the church, so that all of us who are baptized have a fundamental equality in the church. So we are empowered by the Spirit. Where is the church? It's where the Spirit is. Where is the Spirit? Spirit resides in human beings. And the church people who recognize that and make it explicit through the sacramental life do possess some inherent kind of authority.
I think, again, medieval stuff. Thomas would tell us that we're baptized and confirmed precisely to celebrate Eucharist. We're ordered toward the Eucharist, and I mean almost in the sense of being ordained. And I don't mean to blur the distinction between ordained priests and lay people, but we each have a particular role that we play when we celebrate Eucharist and live Eucharist. And I go so far. I mean, the Code of Canon Law goes so far as to say priests should not celebrate the Eucharist without a community there, because that whole part of the celebration is missing.
Indeed. Now, one of the questions that arises in all of this, once we begin to see a more positive role of the laity, and we get onto this idea that they are just to be passive dependent and pay and obey, we now, and we see them empowered by the Spirit, one of the questions becomes, how do we organize this? How do we organize a church so that the charisms of the Spirit can shine through? How do we structure ourselves as a faith community so that we can be a liberating community, so we can be faithful to the gospel, so we can be a credible witness to who Jesus Christ was as he walked this earth? That becomes a very important question. Now, historically, we have organized ourselves according to the models we have found in the culture. Now, not everyone's going to agree with this, but I mean, that's how I see it. So when the church was favored by Constantine and Theodosius in the 4th century, it began to take on the trappings of the Roman Empire. And bishops began to look like feudal lords during the feudal times. And the popes functioned like monarchs in the age of the monarchies. So that the church seems as though it's taken on the structure, the political organization of the culture in which it lives. Now that raises the question of democracy in the church. Can we empower people today? Can we get more authority into the hands of laity by having more democratic structures? So let's begin to analyze that. And again, taking you at your strength, that is the historical dimension, I would just point out that in the 19th century, with the rise of the democracies, the church took a very negative attitude towards this. The church was not terribly open. We see it in the syllabus of errors of Pope Pius IX in 1864, speaking out against this thing known as democracy.
The church has always been very much opposed to the French Revolution. It's interesting the church responded much more to the French Revolution than to the American Revolution, because who knows what those people are doing over there in North America, and that really doesn't have much meaning. But to have somebody topple the structures of a monarchy in Western Europe, now this has some meaning, and things like equality and freedom of conscience and freedom of the press, these are all been things that the church was opposed to at the time.
That's a good contrast you make between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, because the French Revolution ended up being anti-clerical. In other words, the church fell with the other authority institutions. And in the United States, it wasn't that way. The clergy did not suffer from the revolution. It was seen as an overall victory for the people, in a sense. And so it did not spawn anti-clericalism. But when the papacy looks at revolutions and sees the French Revolution, all they see is trouble for the church. It was a self-interest question. Of course they had to be against it because, well, along with the falling of the monarchy and the nobility, also fall the bishops, the hierarchy, and really the authority of the church. So it's not surprising, but it did spawn a whole century of anti-democratic spirit. So not only was the church against sort of democracy in the society as a whole, but certainly against it within the church. I guess the first time that we begin to see anything positive, I think the first time any sympathetic statement was made about democratic states was Pius XII in 1944 at the end of World War II, when he began to see democracy and the democratic states as a possible weapon against the communist world, which was even more fearsome and worrisome to the popes. Now you begin, and this is remarkable, isn't it? It's in 1944 that you get the first positive statements about democracy from the popes, and of course now since then we got a whole movement, but we should see that in context.
And in the United States, these things were all givens for us. This is the way that you do stuff, and in some ways it left American Catholics in kind of a bifurcated state where you had this democratic bit of business that you did with your whole life, and then your religious life was largely feudalistic. And so you had kind of a doublethink that you had to maintain in order to keep those two allegiances going. And of course that was part of anti-Catholicism in America. There was some fear that they would let go of the democratic side of that and say, well, we are the agents of this Italian king.
You can see why John F. Kennedy had trouble in 1960 in running for the presidency, and why there were Protestants in this country that were afraid that his allegiances would be to Rome, and that the democratic process as we knew it here would somehow be diminished because we had a Catholic president. I think that they could draw on documents in the official church literature that to buttress their point. It wasn't just made up. Now, we all know there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in that and in those posturing by many people in this country. But there also was a point to their argument, because the church had certainly not spoken a lot about religious freedom, about freedom of the press, about democratic procedures, either in the political sphere or in the church.
And the reasons, as you pointed out, are largely feudalistic and monarchical, and they don't really have to do with things that are inherent to Catholicism or Christianity. It's particular historical forms that our organization had taken in particular times and places.
Let's look at the Second Vatican Council in relationship to this, because I think from the time of the Pope Pius XII in 1944 up to the Council, which began in 1962, there was development in the Church in relationship to this, much greater openness as time went on to the rights of persons. Gradually, the notion of religious freedom was working its way into the mind of the Church. And there was a growing recognition that the totalitarian societies were the real danger, and that the democracies at least were celebrating freedom. And while they might be too materialistic, too consumerist in orientation, they really were a bulwark against the communist threat. So there was a growing perception of that as we moved up into the Second Vatican Council, which began in 1962. Pope John XXIII, of course, very important in all of that, in opening up the minds of the Church to what was going on in the modern world and celebrating the rights, economic rights, civil rights, social rights that had been enshrined in the democratic countries.
When I think about people, as counterpoint to this, that oppose this, someone like Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre from Switzerland. He's French in his origins, and when I read his obituary some months ago, they pointed out in the obituary what a royalist he was in France, in his native France, and his opposition to the reforms of Vatican II were not simply theological, but in his very political roots, a monarchical way of doing business, where you've got the divine right of kings and things trickle down through the nobility and they make their way to the rest of the people. That's how the whole world is supposed to look. And so while most of the time people wrestled with his theological baggage, in fact it was the political stuff that formed the underpinnings of that, and it was the struggle to maintain that older world order within the Church. It wasn't, again, inherently something part of Catholicism, but rather part of a cultural structure.
I think that's so true, and I was struck by that very same point that you're bringing up, and realizing how that all fit together. It sort of buttressed one of my own theses, that people's political orientation and their attitude towards the Church usually is of a piece, because it's based on a larger mindset. And some people's mindset or worldview is very traditionalist and structured and needs the order, and of course they're looking for governmental structures that act in that way, and like church structures that have that same solidity and clarity and singleness of purpose, and so that it is not surprising. And I think that also takes us back to the way the culture and the Church interact, and in which way the Church really does deal with political systems. Now, the fact of the matter is, as you well pointed out, in the United States and other developed countries, Western democracies, there is a whole understanding of equality, of mutuality, of participation, of voting, of living with pluralism that has become part of our very psyche. Our national consciousness produces that in us. And of course, you then get a movement to say, why can't it be like that in the Church? That's one way to understand the liberal movement in the Catholicism today. Why can't we take those structures that work so well for us and put them into the Church? Well, we have these images of presidents and political candidates who have railed against each other and been totally opposed, and then there's a calm, peaceful transfer of power, and the next thing you know, President Reagan or Carter are interacting at some event. Former presidents, and they're friendly and bantering and so on. And you recognize that, geez, you can live with pluralism. It can happen. You don't have to be at each other's throat. The other does not have to be the enemy.
There are those who say that one of the things that the American culture can contribute to the Church is the notion of the loyal opposition, that you can raise questions within the larger framework of agreement in Christian faith, in unity, and say, I have problems with this, and I wonder about that, and can we look at this, and what are we going to do about that? There's going to be that undercurrent in that conversation, and there's something healthy about that. where people are allowed to do it, and they do it in a way that they want to build up the church, and it's not simply a question of carping or trying to tear things down.
Right. Loyal opposition is part of the democratic process. Very important point. You and I both heard a lecture by the outstanding theologian Avery Dulles in which he took up the question of democracy in the church, and he played off two particular theologians as representing polar opposite views. Maybe that's too strong. Representing different views on democracy in the church. One is Edward Schillebeeckx, the Dutch theologian, and who has written an important book called Church, the Human Story of God. Just came out in 1990. And the chapter 4 in that is entitled Towards Democratic Rule of the Church as a Community of God. Chapter 4, Towards Democratic Rule of the Church. And in that chapter, he begins to suggest that the church is missing the boat in not bringing more democratic procedures into it all. He says that we're not tied to any one political system. We might think we were, but just as we learned that we could move from a Roman system to a feudal one, to a monarchical one, as in terms of how we structured ourselves in the church, we ought to be open to democratic procedures today. In fact, he thinks that democratic procedures fit in with the notion of the gospel at certain essential points. The idea of participation, of co-responsibility for the church, that all of us are empowered by the Spirit, that we all have our own charisms to build up the body of Christ, that there's a fundamental equality of all the members, that these themes enunciated by Vatican II suggest that we could profit by more democratic structures and procedures in the church.
And I think that these themes that Vatican II played up, while they are part of our contemporary culture, I think they found a lot of it in their research into the patristic church, the church of the first 500-600 years, that there was participation, that there were many different charisms. And those things find their way into the Vatican II documents more in terms of that historical and biblical research than a simple appropriation of contemporary culture, which is what I think a lot of people presume. And so there's some verification of that. It's part of our tradition to look to various people for their charisms and to include them and to find ways to use everybody's abilities.
Schillebeeckx, again, we're on this one side of the pro-democracy forces here. We're going to get to Hans Urs von Balthasar, another 20th century theologian who's opposed to democracy in the church. But to stay with Schillebeeckx for a while, he borrows from the field of sociology of knowledge and says that really societal structures or any community structures develop around the notion of protecting the values that are most important to the people who belong to it. And again, today, what we see in the church, for so many, it's a question of personal dignity, respect for individuals, of living out the essence of the gospel and so on. And it seems as though democratic procedures really could often free up that liberating power of the gospel and give people a greater sense of participation, of personal worth, of self-esteem, of being able to contribute. We see that at the parish level. When people have the opportunity to make decisions, to be involved in the process, is exactly when they get more out of the participation.
And that phrase, democratic processes, that's a very broad sort of thing here. I don't know that he's arguing for one person, one vote, and that we would caucus and form parties, and but I think he is looking for a much more participatory approach to church that really will carry the voice of the people of God. That's where the term democracy comes from.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. He even says that we would not have to have periodic elections. It's not what he's calling for, but he certainly would like to see more participation of the people as a whole in choosing their leaders, for example. Going back to what we saw in the early church, when there was a way in which the holiest and the best theologians were acclaimed by the people as the leaders of the community and became the bishops. He would like to see more of that sort of thing, so that it is, I think, the co-responsibility and the participation that are the notes of democracy that he wants, and not so much periodic elections. In other words, he's not for a 4-year election of bishops, 4-year terms and re-elect them and so on. That's not what he's pushing for. But participation and co-responsibility, I think, are what it's all about. And I think one of the things that Schillebeeckx again says is that there's a model for the kind of authority that we have in the church, and that it's really the rule of God. It's the way Christ gave us the example of being the servant and calling forth the talents of the others, of orchestrating these various charisms. That seems to be one way of thinking about how you would get more democracy, more democratic spirit, at least, among the leaders in the church. Jeff, should we go to Balthasar and say something about his position? Maybe you can help me here. But the question is, first of all, he's more opposed to this democratic procedure. He's a very conservative theologian, a traditionalist in many of his views, very influential on Cardinal Ratzinger, a major figure in the church hierarchy today. Died, was made a cardinal right before he died, wrote a multi-volume work called Glory of the Lord, often taken up by the neoconservatives as their hero or their prime theologian. But Balthasar says that we really don't need elections and we shouldn't have them because authority comes to the bishops not from the people but directly from God, and that they are the successors of the apostles, and there's a sort of top-down approach to this whole thing. And he says the real need is not for democratic procedures but to get bishops who are holier. That seems to be his positive thrust. But let's look at this from various angles.
Well, I like the idea that holiness has got to be a criterion for selection, and that's what stands it. Because the authority in the church is a very different sort of thing than authority in the world. I mean, I hate to make those kinds of distinctions, but the church is a certain kind of institution, and I really resonate, I mean, in some sense, to what he's saying here, that the church is a different kind of institution. And so we need to approach things in a way that speaks to its nature. I don't know, though, that the way that we currently do things necessarily gets us the holiest people, and that the way that we appoint people right now, I think for a lot of people they have a very cynical view of it. It seems to be an old boys network. It seems to be one kind of individual appointing like-minded people and excluding people who disagree. And that's a problem with that sort of approach. But that's really what he wants to do, is have a more it's a pointed sort of thing. It's a more feudal sort of vision, frankly.
That he has, right. And I think that he himself is not drunk in some of the positive notions of democracy that we would see in the world today and in the way it functions for the well-being of people. So his point is that God and Christ are the real authorities, that Christ gives the power to the apostles and their successors and not to the whole church. And therefore, the church doesn't have any secular constitution. And the church is distinctive, and I think we do have to recognize that. In other words, the church claims that it has a particular wisdom, a set of teachings that it is supposed to pass on. It's not just an open-ended system like a modern university that would say, well, there's not any one truth that we're supposed to pass on. We're open to all truth and investigating it and passing it on. Therefore, that would have a very different structure in his mind than would the church, which was started by Christ and has the Bible as its norm, has a revelation it's supposed to pass on, has a mandate from Christ to do it, and so on. So he stresses the uniqueness of the church vis-a-vis other political institutions.
And it relies on a certain notion of revelation too. I mean, it's a classical deposit of faith sort of sense that there's content that has been dropped and that's available and that drives the organism, but there isn't any development. Well, I don't say isn't any development, but you want to pass that on intact without playing with it at all. But it seems to be ahistorical to me. It seems to lack an awareness that in fact we do adapt and move. That this hasn't happened in a way that's maintained a monolithic structure all the way through.
Despite our efforts here, Jeff, to be impartial observers of the theological scene, we are obviously coming down on the side of Edward Skillebecks here and in favor of more democratic procedures in the church, especially participation, co-responsibility. It's a little hard to see that Balthasar's arguments are really decisive or compelling, for us anyway.
I'd like to take some shots at Skillebeck's side, though, in an attempt to be fair, and I don't know. The democratic process has given rise to an awful lot of ugliness, and especially in an election year, the kinds of things that we say about the candidates, and I hear these kinds of things about people in the church. You know, people say horrible things about Cardinal Ratzinger and his state of his health and things like that. I mean, if we admit a more democratic approach, I have no doubt that these kinds of things will seep in as well, and that's a danger of those. And I also sometimes think people have the fantasy that if we have a more democratic approach, we're going to get at the truth. I don't know if democracy gets us to the truth. Again, if you look at the people that we do elect in our regular processes, it's always going to have to be a mitigated sort of democracy. Or if we're going to go with Urs von Balthasar, it's a mitigated sort of feudalism. Neither one of those in a pure form maybe are going to take us where we want to go.
That's a very good point. Let's take the strongest argument against democracy in the church is that if you get sort of a common denominator at work in the church, you will not have an ability to critique the culture. The cultural values, in our case, some positive ones like freedom and so on will be celebrated, but you'll also get a lot of consumerism and a lot of materialism and individualism, and you won't be able to criticize the culture. That's, I think, the strongest argument. And so if you're going to have more democracy, you've got to figure out a way to overcome that so that you remain under the gospel and attuned to the cross of Christ in making your criticism of the culture.
A few years ago, I ran into a classmate of mine at a high school reunion, and I said, "Well, how do you like the current president?" He said, "I've got a job." I said, "Yeah, but how do you like him?" He said, "I've got a job." I mean, that's the only criterion that he had for electing this person or not someone else, and we tend politically to elect our own interests, and that's a danger within the church as well as without. I mean, there are partisans of various points of view, and they say, "I want my view to prevail," and there's not an awareness that there's some value in another approach. They would deny pluralism. I mean, the thing that they want for themselves, they would deny to the other person within the church, and that's the danger of that.
Well, Jeff, we've not solved this problem of democracy in the church by any means. We could look at ways in which Skilobex and Balthasar are on the same level. They are against autocratic rule in the church. They want greater role for the laity and so on. They want the church to be more credible. The office holders should be holy. The faithful can criticize at times, but with respect. So you could try to put it together, but I think the major thing we're seeing is that, from our perspective, that the church should be open to these democratic procedures and more participation of all the members of the church, which we think will enrich the church and make it a more credible witness.